This webinar is being hosted by the Center for Regional Economic Advancement at Cornell University and welcomes constituents from the Johnson Entrepreneurship track, the Upstate New York I-Corps node, Black Entrepreneurs in Training at Cornell, the Southern Tier Startup Alliance, We Cornell, Grow New York, 76 West, Rev Ithaca Startup Works, and Rev's hardware programs, as well as Cornell Engineering Commercialization Fellows and Kessler Fellows. This webinar will be recorded, and a link to the recording will be available for all attendees. If you have a question at any time during the session, please use the Q&A function on the webinar screen. Type in your question, and a CREA team will monitor the questions submitted and ask the panelists to answer. If you would like to receive a closed caption version of this recording post-event, please let us know. This webinar will be posted to our website, which is at CREA, crea.cornell.edu. Today, we're going to first start by introducing the panelists, and then we'll have a discussion along the way of returning to work after COVID-19, followed by some questions and answers. But please don't wait for the very end if you have questions along the way, because we'd like to address those questions as the discussion continues. Let me first start by introducing our panelists. We're joined today by Harry Katz, a professor of collective bargaining at the ILR School at Cornell University, and Paul Wagner, a professor at the Cornell School of Hotel Administration and a shareholder and CFO of the Stokes Wagner Hospitality Law Practice. I'm also here with my colleague, Ken Rother, the director of Rev, Ithaca Startups Works. We're going to break this discussion into three different phases. We'll first start by looking at recovery mode. Employers are now pivoting from issues surrounding closures and layoffs to planning for recovery and reopening. Then we'll transition to what is the new normal. There's predictions of a deep and lasting recession combined with health and safety issues that will result in a reimagined employment norm. And then we'll look at longer-term economic and social realities. The COVID-19 pandemic is likely to fundamentally alter the employment relationship and the role of organized labor. And so we'll have a discussion from both the employer side and the labor side, and we'll look at various issues that are prompted by the new norm in which we're living. So Paul, let me start by turning to you. You know, as an attorney and as somebody who's working with employers large and small all over the country right now, what are the hair on fire problems that are facing employers during the pandemic as they prepare recovery plans to re-engage the workforce?
Thanks, Nate, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. So just a little bit of background before I launch into the answer to your question. My law practice focuses primarily on the hospitality and restaurant industries in the Americas, with a focus on the United States. And you know, we obviously our entire economy has shut down over the pandemic, and the hotel industry and restaurant industry has been particularly affected, and probably will be for a much longer period of time than other industries. And you know, when most of the businesses have completely shuttered and laid a lot of people off, furloughed others, and I think that distinction is something that we want to talk about today. Permanent layoffs where the employment relationship is severed versus an unpaid leave of absence on furlough. Now, just in the last week or two, these businesses are now pivoting towards, as you said, the recovery plans. And the first step of that is really reimagining the business. What is it going to look like upon reopening? How long is it going to be that smaller, more streamlined, more innovative and adaptive model? And you know, when do you reach the new normal? So there's sort of a critical path analysis that's going on in these businesses, and probably in a lot of yours, to determine both timing and substance. And the employment issues that we're seeing and that we're helping our clients plan for along the way are you know, really what's going to happen to the workforce. If I've got 500 employees at a hotel in a large metropolitan center in the United States, I may be planning to open that hotel with only 300 employees or even 250 employees. So how do I choose those? And so you really have to be careful. Employers have to be careful on the criteria used. Obviously, in the union setting, it's usually done by seniority, where the more senior people come back first. Most non-union businesses are not following that path. They're looking at talent. They're looking at past performance and future potential, because they're trying to open to do the same level of service, the same level of business with fewer individuals. So you really have to do a disparate impact analysis on the criteria being used to reopen. Discrimination laws are very are really the center point of that. You want to have good documented methods for choosing those individuals. There's also specific requirements under the Age Discrimination in Employment Act with regard to that selection criteria. I think there are a lot of wage and hour issues as well. A lot of businesses which are still operating are trying to do it on a skeleton crew. If you're using salaried managers to do work, if they put in 1 hour in a work week under the Fair Labor Standards Act, they're entitled to their entire salary for that week. So how do you take a person who is working 50, 60 hours a week on a salary and use them sporadically without having to pay that entire salary, but not running afoul of the wage and hour laws? And there's a number of toolkits you can use to do that, including a percentage reduction of salary prospectively, converting that person to an hourly model, or even supplementing with voluntary use of paid time off or vacation. I think the big issue as we come closer to reopening and ramping out into the new normal are going to be health and safety issues. And you'll hear Harry and I talk a lot about health and safety, both in terms of the employer's obligation and how those obligations are going to change over time, as well as the role of unions and the organized labor view of health and safety as an opportunity to organize. I think a lot of those health and safety issues they're going to start with, how do I safely return my employees to a workplace that where social distancing is still either enforced by local regulation or by recommendation of CDC and other medical organizations? Do I have to provide personal protective equipment or PPE? Is that going to be a legal obligation or just a best practice? And how do I deal with people who have compromised immune systems? And how do I make an accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act if underlying medical conditions like that put them at more risk for contracting COVID-19 and then having a serious medical episode arising from that? I think that's going to be a really big issue. And what we're already seeing are employees refusing to come back to work because the employer has not taken adequate precautions to create a safe environment. And if you add to it the fact that many of those employees are making as much, if not more money on unemployment with the federal $600 a week top up and extension of the unemployment benefit period, there's really very much a disincentive to come back to work. Now, I think that curve starts to change as you get to the end of the unemployment period, because people are realizing that money's going to run out and they need to plan for employment. But I think that medical issue, that health and safety medical issue is going to be a really big one. And so, I think we're already seeing a push in certain states like Texas and Georgia to open immediately on a limited basis. And a lot of people are saying too soon, and not trying to take a political position here. This is more of a reducing risk from a legal standpoint. But if businesses do open too soon, in the sense that the contagion rate is still high, you're also looking at potential lawsuits from employees who get sick as a result of coming back to work, which they will claim was too early. Now, normally workers' compensation is a protection for employers as that's the exclusive remedy for an employee who's hurt at work. But there are exceptions to the workers' comp laws, which are all state-based, for gross negligence. So if you know, some of these businesses, if they open quickly against the recommendations of entities like CDC and don't take adequate precautions, that could be viewed as grossly negligent and therefore an exception to workers' comp. So that's an overview. I think what we're also seeing, I know Harry wants to talk about this as well, we're seeing a lot of labor unions use this pandemic and the recovery period to organize. In particular, the UFCW, which represents a lot of food service and grocery workers, are very, very actively organizing non-union food establishments, and their organizing is built around health and safety, lack of PPE, lack of adequate precautions. And so I think you're going to see that grow. Cornell's Kyler Center over at the hotel school did a webinar the other day with the president of Unite Here, Dee Taylor, who echoed the same issues, which is that they're seeing this as an opportunity, and they're going to take that opportunity to organize hotels and restaurants around health and safety. So I think that's an overview.
So Paul, as we think about things like health and safety, you know, traditionally those have been, you know, there's regulations of OSHA and various, you know, sort of standards, but are those standards really the standards that are applicable in this environment, or has all of that changed because now there seems to be a greater need to provide the types of adequate protection that people are looking for employees in particular?
Well, to your point, everything's evolving rapidly. If you go on to the OSHA COVID website or the CDC COVID website page, you'll see that it's updated daily. There's an enormous amount of information. The recommendations are evolving rapidly. And so I would urge employers to keep up with that. What's interesting about OSHA and the federal government is, and again, this is not a political statement, but this crisis has shown how poor our safety net is on a federal level to protect. And OSHA is now affirmatively deferring the health and safety compliance issues to employers. They have said that they don't have the human power, they don't have the assets, the staff to respond to the thousands and thousands of OSHA complaints that have come in. So I think you're going to see that this is going to be self-enforcement. And what that typically means in our legal system is the plaintiff's bar or plaintiff's lawyers are going to fill in that gap. So I think you're going to see quickly evolving recommendations from CDC, from OSHA, and from other agencies and entities, with then the litigious nature of our society causing an explosion of employment-related health and safety lawsuits coming out of this, which then will in fact evolve the law even further. And I think the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, is also going to be a platform from which you're going to see a lot of litigation, particularly surrounding that reasonable accommodation requirement. That's one of the murkiest legal standards in employment law. Before this whole thing started, it's going to get even murkier and is going to be used as a significant sword for the attempt to impose obligations on employers and ultimately liability.
So turning to you, Harry, what do you see as the role of unions in this environment, and what's going to change as we as we look towards, like, recovery and restarting the economy?
Well, I just on a number of the points that Paul has ably made, and that is that health and safety and occupational illness issues are just going to be absolutely paramount in a way we haven't seen in modern times. In some ways, it's going to be somewhat similar to the kind of issues that were raised in the early part of the 20th centuries. In the 1920s and 30s, people were worried about getting injured on the job with machinery without adequate protections. And now there's a different kind of threat provided by the pandemic and the threat of a virus, but it's going to be a really big issue. And it's not just going to be an issue in unionized settings. I want to emphasize employees are going to make demands on employers. Employers need to comply with the law, as Paul's correctly pointing out, but they also need to meet employees' expectations. And if they don't, they're going to face protests. They're going to face not only the possibility that unions will try and organize those protests into organizing drives, but they're going to face protests from affinity groups. We've already seen protests in Amazon warehouses and in a number of grocery stores. We see it in healthcare facilities by nurses, that all these employees are protesting on the grounds that the personal protective equipment isn't meeting their needs, and it's not satisfactory. And so, Nate, your point, how are employers going to comply with the law? They need to pay attention to that and other regulations, but they in particular need to find ways to meet and satisfy employees' expectations about health and safety. That's going to be paramount. The other issue I'd just like to emphasize is we're clearly, whether it's in the recovery phase or in the longer term phase, we're going to have more virtual work. And there's lots of issues that are going to be surfaced because of that. Which employees get to qualify for virtual work? For some of a firm's operations, it's going to make a lot of sense to continue to have virtual work, but for other operations, it's not going to make sense. How are you going to make that decision? How are you going to communicate that decision? How are you going to manage those employees that continue to work virtually, or at least partially now work virtually, if their work environment switches to be somewhat virtual and somewhat on-site and in office? And again, it's an issue in union settings. Lots of unions are going to raise issues about fairness and equity, seniority rights and all, but it's also going to be an issue where there aren't unions. You need to meet employee expectations and employee desires, again, whether or not there's a union, on both, I would say, health and safety issues, and again, on this new form of work that's going to involve more distance, more virtual work.
So, Harry, on that question of more virtual work, one of the folks listening in had a question, and what are the employer's responsibilities in terms of health and safety for those workers that are required to work at home? Are there any?
Well, Paul I think should also chime in on this on the legal matters, but the employer has obligations. It has obligations, legal, but again, it also has obligations just in terms of employee expectations. Whether or not you're abiding by rules and regulations, you've got to have a workforce that feels satisfied by the conditions that they face, or they're going to protest. And again, I can't emphasize that enough. We have a workforce that's ready to protest. Before the pandemic, we protested at Google and high-tech workplaces where we hadn't seen collective actions before, in part because unions aren't present in those workplaces. But now employees aren't going to put up with things that in the past they might have been more ready to accept. Let me let Paul chime in too, because he's more expert on the legal issues on that question.
And as I understand the question, what are the employer's responsibilities for accommodating telework or remote work? And the principal law that places the obligation on the employer in that context would be the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Harry's point about who gets selected is really the key, because if I'm immunocompromised or have another medical condition that puts me at a heightened risk of mortality or serious reaction from COVID, there's a very strong argument that my employer under the ADA has a duty to find any reasonable solution that would allow me to accomplish some or all of the essential functions of my job without putting me at risk. And so that would mean considering telework, remote work, and a flex-a-place type arrangement. And so it's really a case-by-case test. But to Harry's point, I think the ADA is going to evolve to be more, to give a greater obligation to employers to be creative in that regard, and what is reasonable, I think is going to shift towards a much more employee-friendly, flexi workplace setting. And remember, even past cases under the ADA, it also, what is reasonable is a sliding scale based on the capitalization and financial ability of the employer to make accommodation. So the wealthier, more capitalized, larger employers are going to have a greater financial obligation to find solutions to allow people to work without coming into a workplace that could cause them medical harm.
So, Paul, for employers that are looking at, managing this reduction in force, and let's say they do have to go from 500 employees to 250 employees or something along those lines, right? How do they make those decisions without triggering all sorts of potential legal liability?
So, the easiest, but also the least valuable is to do it by seniority, because you're not necessarily getting your best people. And that's the dilemma. But it's the most protected in the sense that if you use that as the sole criterion, that's certainly a legitimate way to do it, and you're protected against liability for discrimination. But for most employers who are looking at talent and potential and leadership and maybe the ability to work remotely, being a self-starter, a high emotional intelligence, what have you, what we would recommend is that you come up with an objective, clear, written rating criteria. Now, it's easy if you're eliminating an entire job title or a single incumbent position because you don't need it in the post-recovery period. So, for example, we're seeing, hotels where they're eliminating the concierge position and basically blending that into the front desk agent. So if I'm eliminating my entire concierge department, there's no discrimination there. I've just eliminated the department because I need to cut costs. But where I have to reduce a particular department by 50%, by 40%, and I have to compare Paul to Nate to Harry to determine who's going to be identified for permanent layoff and who's coming back, that's where you need that objective rating system, that objective set of criteria. And you want to document it so that you defend your choices down the road if you get sued for discrimination on any protected class. And you want to do a disparate impact analysis, and what that is that you would actually look at your first draft of identifying people for permanent layoff and look at their EEO, equal employment opportunity, protected class criteria, and see if your rating system, while not intentionally discriminatory, had a disparate or adverse impact on a particular group. That doesn't mean you're going to necessarily change your initial assessment, but you're at least going to look at it and say, hey, this is riskier than I thought because the vast majority of people I selected for permanent layoff are over 40, for example, and therefore in the protected class under the ADEA. So we're recommending a very, very careful, objective, sensible process because we are expecting a slew of discrimination lawsuits coming out of these mass layoffs that are going to occur.
So as we transition to this new normal environment, right? And this question's for Harry. What are the labor and employment issues that will impact employers the biggest in this sort of new normal world?
Well, I think it's an extension of the issues we've been discussing. Health and safety and occupational illness are going to be enormous issues. It's elevated concern that appears now. The pandemic may reappear. There may be another spread of a virus several years from now. I mean, the workforce's attitudes towards health and safety are just elevated, and I think they're going to be elevated for the foreseeable future. So you're going to have a lot of the same questions that are just going to stick around regarding, is the firm adequately providing protective equipment? How's it deal with people that have prior conditions? And also, is it creating a culture and an environment in which people feel good coming to work? I mean, let's keep that all in mind. As we start coming through the recovery, hopefully sooner than later, firms are going to have to start competing again in the labor market. In the medium term, short term, and medium term, the opportunity is there for firms. There's going to be a slack labor market. Unemployment rate's going to be astronomical, and there it's a question of how firms and whether firms can take advantage of that opportunity when there are needs that they face to be more selective in their hiring. But again, going back to the issues we've raised, people are going to protest if they don't feel satisfied by either health and safety issues or the criteria used to decide who gets to work virtually and for how often, and how their performance is assessed when they're working virtually. So there's going to be issues particularly brought to the fore through in union settings, but even where there aren't unions, you're going to need and you're going to want to have policies that meet the expectations of your employees. And I think a longer run question is, are the firms going to take that as an opportunity to differentiate themselves and say, we have terrific policies regarding health and safety. We have terrific policies regarding flex work and virtual work. We've communicated those policies. We've interacted and engaged the workforce in the development and application of the policies. So can the firm use this as an opportunity, as well as facing the pressures they're going to face from either legal regulation, potential union organizing, or affinity group mass protests of one sort or another?
So I'm really interested in this notion of competition and the sense that, by better positioning, an employer will be able to attract talent or sort of setting a higher threshold than just the minimum of what is legally required. What do you see as things that, are easy for employers to do to be able to sort of show that they are meeting sort of a higher standard for health and safety or otherwise?
Well, I'll quickly chime in about that, but I'm also interested in hearing what Paul's views are. Is again communicating with the workforce, engaging the workforce in the development of policies and application of policies. Right? This shouldn't be perceived as just sort of top down. All right, here's the new way we work, either health and safety standards or personal protective equipment or virtual work. The firm is going to be challenged ever more to develop policy it feels comfortable about and feels highly motivated about. That's a particular issue facing entrepreneurial and small firms, right? Because they don't have the luxury of having sort of excess labor sitting around. They've got to have really high performers at their workplace, and they're going to need to have highly motivated employees who are now going to be very, very worried in ways we just haven't seen in our lifetimes about their health and safety and about how and whether they're really along to their aspects of work.
Let me, Nate, there's an interesting question when you're ready.
Sure. So I'll pose this to Paul. It says, how does a nonprofit who is considered essential, working with vulnerable clients, determine reasonable accommodations for staff who have underlying health conditions or who feel they are in jeopardy and do not want to work directly with clients?
It's a great question, and I think that I'll start by saying I think not-for-profits, because of their status and their lack of capital are given more flexibility on what is a reasonable accommodation. But you still have an obligation to provide for an accommodation for someone based upon a serious medical condition for themselves or for a family member. And so if there is a medical basis for the concern, and that is documented and supported by their primary care physician or another specialist, you do initially have a duty to try to reach an accommodation. And if that's if you're a homeless shelter or a social worker who has to be there in person with the clients that you're supporting, it presents a real challenge. Now, we are seeing more and more medical professionals doing office visits and consultations by video. So that may be an accommodation that a person asks for, and it might be determined to be reasonable. So I know I'm giving you sort of a mushy answer. And the problem is that it's such a mushy area of the law, and it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. And it does come down to how much does that cost, and can this employer pay for it? It also comes down to what the essential functions and duties of that job are. Can it be done remotely? Can it be done semi-remotely, meaning you can keep that person sequestered, albeit at the work site in a more secure office setting, or distance from other coworkers and clients while still at the place of treatment or business. So there's just a whole host of issues that are going to arise in this new environment, and the evolving standards of OSHA, CDC, and other epidemiological agencies are going to play a prominent role in determining what that answer is.
So as an example of that, if an employer, as a part of the workforce that's working from home, how do the requirements to offer adequate protection or reasonable accommodations apply in the virtual environment? So, if my work desk had a big monitor stand so I could, stand up and go down and that kind of thing, does an employer have an obligation to now provide all those types of devices for home offices so that people can, quote unquote, zoom in from home?
They very well may, just as employers have been held to the obligation of providing a blind person a computer technology to allow them to be a reservationist, or person who's hearing impaired to have certain technology available to them. So I think the same obligations will be imposed in that environment. Certainly the cost of a reliable internet connection and the cost of the hardware may also be an accommodation or a burden that's placed on the employer, if that is reasonable to allow the person to work remotely based on a medical condition.
So Harry, a question came in from the audience that I'd like you to address. It says, I think a lot of businesses, not just US based, are reducing their dependence on China, especially on supply chain issues. What are the chances of companies bringing back jobs to the US?
Well, that's a really interesting, great question. There already was some movement back to the US. For example, a number of firms, whether it's in telecommunications or others that relied on reservationists and customer service representatives, they had moved them very aggressively 10, 15 years ago offshore to India and to other locations. And we already saw evidence, far before the pandemic, that many of those arrangements weren't working out very well. The quality of service wasn't what employees expected and what the employer wanted. I do think this pandemic, as that question suggests, is going to induce a reassessment of global supply chains. However, I don't think global supply chains are going to go away. I mean, they're too fundamental to the way nearly all businesses operate. I think what you're going to see is a reassessment and some incremental adjustment that'll lead firms to bring some of that work back into the US. But for those that think, you know, it's the end of the day of China supplying electronic components and other manufacturing components and other parts of Asia, whether it's in clothing and apparel and other sectors where the supply chains are so deep, I think those supply chains are going to stay very deep, but there will be, as the question suggests, some new reassessment, and at the margin, I think firms may well bring some work back into the U.S. Because of these concerns raised by the pandemic. But I don't see a major collapse in global supply chains.
Okay. Why don't we talk a little bit about long-term changes and sort of what does work from home look like moving forward? Paul, what do you see as sort of the biggest issues for employers needing to sort of manage the workforce from home?
You know, I think that the remote workplace and health and safety will continue to be the driving forces. You're going to need, I think, the makeup, the profile of the successful employee changes. I think talent selection changes in the virtual remote world. I think that's going to have an effect on education, our public education and university and college level education. I also think that health insurance or health coverage, health care for employees is going to change. As I stated earlier, I think this pandemic has shown the utter lack of a safety net in the United States versus other countries. And one of the principal deficiencies is health insurance. Not saying that we're going to see nationalized health insurance in the immediate term, but I think a lot of people who previously were reluctant to look at a more comprehensive solution to health insurance are starting to think that either a nationalized plan or something along the lines of the ACA makes more sense. And look, the burden on employers to provide affordable health care was very difficult before this crisis. It's going to be even more difficult for employers to afford a broad-based, decent health care. And so again, you know, I think you're gonna see a lot more of a call at the national and state level for a solution to that problem. I also think that you're going to see a lot of, in the nearer term, a lot of local ordinances and regulations that are affecting the health of employees and restrictions around and requirements around a safe workplace. You're seeing it already. Los Angeles just passed an ordinance, for example, that has a number of requirements, not the least of which is that when employees are brought back from furlough, they have to be brought back in order of seniority. And that's obviously an ordinance that was pushed by organized labor, by unions, because it's applied to union and non-union workplaces. Look for more of that to occur, particularly with the remainder of this administration in Washington that has, you know, stated a goal to dismantle the administrative state at the federal level. So you'll see states and more likely municipalities fill that void.
So when you talk about filling a void, there's obviously the legal side of the equation, whether it be federal or state, but there's also I think, opportunities for sort of entrepreneurship, entrepreneurially minded folks. What do you see as some of the opportunities for startups or other, young companies that are looking to navigate sort of this environment?
Technology applied to safe workplace and safe working arrangements. I see that as the greatest opportunity, because that's going to be the conversation everywhere. And how can we take an industry or a job function that used to require an in-person workforce and allow it to be either fully or partially remote. Technology surrounding more spaced out workspaces. How do we get the job done by bringing in only a third of the workforce we had before and keeping them sparsely spread in the work environment. And I think food and beverage is going to be an interesting evolution, or there will be an interesting evolution there, because I think social distancing is with us for quite some time, and other precautions surrounding these types of pandemics. So I think that's going to change rapidly. Takeout versus dining in, solutions to or opportunities surrounding that phenomenon will present a lot of entrepreneurial opportunity, I believe.
So, Harry, what do you see as, the big changes within these sort of industries that we've identified: airlines, travel, hospitality, assembly lines, kind of stuff? What do you see as the sort of new developments that'll occur within this new realm in which we're living?
Well, I think we're going to see some traditional services go away or go nearly to zero. Let me give you an example. In the hospitality sector, the banquet servers who work in large hotels that hold conventions or throw parties and events, whether for those conventions or just individuals wanting to have a family event or a celebration, there's going to be a dramatic decline in those sort of events, right? First question is, what's going to happen to all those banquet servers? They happen to be an important part in the sectors in which the hospitality industry is unionized. The banquet servers, as Paul knows well, are an important part of the membership and politically very important within Unite Here. So what's going to happen to them? But then, in terms of small firms and entrepreneurial firms, people are going to still want to celebrate. And now the question is, how are they going to celebrate? There's probably going to be new opportunities to find ways to meet those needs. Again, as the economy recovers, people are going to still want some sort of experience that's been denied or it's been shifted because of fears about a virus or a pandemic. And then again, just to return to the basic point, employees are going to protest if they're not satisfied by the work conditions that they face in over the long term, right? And again, as the economy recovers, what we've observed historically is unions and militants grows when economic conditions improve, because employees have less risk associated with protesting because they face the opportunity to find other work, and they know the firms have more resources to meet their needs and demands. So again, as the economy restabilizes, hopefully in the not too distant future, bargaining leverage is going to shift back more towards employees and towards unions than it certainly is now in the midst of a deep recession. And so that's going to be a critical issue as well.
So a question that has come in from the audience is, will sustainability and climate protection be reinforced as contributors to the pandemics, or will they be placed on the back burner in this sort of new era in which we're living? Harry?
Well, I mean, I think that this pandemic, it's a deep social political question as to what its broader ramifications are. But somewhat along the lines of what Paul's pointing out is, I think it's going to lead people to kind of reassess the role of the government. This is clearly a case in the midst of a pandemic where we need the government, we need public services, we need public goods. And you could imagine that that inclination carries over into issues like climate change and the environment very generally. People now recognizing more forcefully that the government provides a critical service and meets critical needs. The government is certainly in a number of states, there's lots of questions about whether the federal government is really meeting our needs, but state governments have really been reactivated, and that just conveys a notion that public services provide and meet critical needs.
So Paul, here's a question that I think is interesting. Do you think that the shift towards work from home will have a long-term changes towards the way firms manage employees with regards to the traditional 40-hour work week? In other words, it seems that many employees can be more efficient while working at home. Will that have an effect on expected working hours and the 40-hour work week?
Absolutely. I think we were already seeing those changes occur as the workforce evolved here in the United States and around the globe. And I think the push towards remote work will increase that pace. Remember that the 40-hour work week is a function of a law from the 1930s, that the Fair Labor Standards Act that arose during the FDR administration, that has not been changed since then. So, and it created the concept of minimum wage and maximum hours, meaning 40 hours after which the employer is penalized by having to pay time and a half. That's the concept of overtime. So it's a very antiquated law when you overlay it to modern society, and I think it'll be seen as even more antiquated as we evolve more rapidly to a remote working world. So there would need to be some legal changes to allow more flexibility, but I think that's reasonable to expect in the near term. And to the point of productivity, off-hour productivity, depending on the employee, absolutely agree with that as well. So I think you're going to see a lot of changes in that regard, and frankly, I think they're welcome changes.
So Harry, I'd like you to chime in on that too. I mean, is there a possibility that, the Fair Labor Standards, gets thrown out, or the 40-hour work week is changed?
Well, there was a lot of questioning, in addition to the good points Paul's raised, over different issues surrounding the Fair Labor Standards Act. Subcontract work, who's a supervisor, and how do we distinguish between a supervisor and a worker? There's different union rights and entitlements if you're a worker versus a supervisor. Subcontract work, great debate. I just build on a point that Paul's made earlier. I think it's going to be a really important factor. We're going to see a lot more action at the state level over these matters. We've seen it already. California passed a rather aggressive law recently about subcontract work, particularly targeted on Uber and Lyft, who are actually still contesting that law. And this pandemic has again elevated the role of state governments. And I think it's going to further need to innovative policies, whereas in the past we may have expected those policy changes to come down uniformly, consistently through federal legislation. Certainly if political paralysis continues at the federal level, you're going to see ever more activity at the state level, and as Paul mentioned before, at the local level. It's not only Los Angeles that's being aggressive. Minimum wages were being changed in the last few years at the local level. We hadn't seen that in our history, and I think this event is going to build further momentum to that.
So we've alluded to various union stuff earlier in this conversation. I just kind of want to sort of hit the nail on the head if possible, which is, do you really see that there'll be a significant uptick in union organizing as a result of this pandemic, or is it too early to say, Harry?
So I'd say we're going to see an uptick in organizing activity, and I think that'll lead to some increase for sure in union membership and extent of coverage of collective bargaining. But is there going to be a really massive, sizable shift? that I think really is fundamentally unclear. There's lots of reasons, we don't have the time to go into it, why unions are having trouble organizing in the workforce, and a lot of those issues still remain. But at the same time, we are certainly, Paul's highlighted, we see unions, UFCW, Unite Here, and others announce they're gonna hit the road, particularly focused on health and safety issues. And so there'll be a lot more activity. And just the last point, I've mentioned it before, is we're going to see social protests even outside of unions over health and safety and a lot of the issues we've covered. And that's going to certainly be a different setting and environment over the next several years. And time will tell whether it leads to a substantial increase in levels of unionization.
So Harry, this question came in from the audience and it says, do you see more union organizing by faculty, such as adjuncts on university campuses, perhaps driven by health and safety, but also work at home expectations?
Well, absolutely. I mean, over the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of activity on university and college campuses by faculty that are lecturers and adjuncts. The share of faculties across universities and colleges that are covered by tenure is shrunk dramatically, and the work conditions for many of those adjuncts and lecturers are not very good. I'm proud to say that Cornell treats its lecturers and adjuncts quite well, but in many other colleges and universities, that's not the case. And the question is right. These set of issues about health and safety and virtual work, we're not even sure exactly if we're going to return to campus in the fall. You know, if the pandemic rebounds, you know, it may not be just the fall that's in jeopardy. It may be the whole next academic year, and who knows about the future. That can put lot more and new demands on faculty. The same is true of public school teachers. A lot more demands and pressures put on them because of the increase in virtual work and virtual education. So that certainly is going to be an arena to look at to see how much of a growth do we see either in unionization or other forms of protest among university adjuncts and lecturers.
Yeah, any other comments that you'd like to add to that, Paul?
I think if I put myself in the position of a union and the union organizers, I agree with Harry completely that there's great opportunity, and it's not just health and safety of the workplace, but as I mentioned before, health insurance. Because one of the calling cards of a lot of unions is what they call free insurance. It's not, I'm using air quotes because it's obviously not free, but they typically try to negotiate a package where the employee does not have to contribute to premium for health care, whether it's the employer plan or a Taft-Hartley insurance fund. And so I think you're going to see a return of that as a prominent basis for organizing, and look for recognitional picketing, meaning the unions and employees picketing in front of an employer's place of business because of health and safety issues. You know, keep us safe, keep our guests safe, messages like that, in order to get the employer to recognize the union as the representative of the workers without the need for an election or a card check neutrality agreement. So the opportunity is certainly there. Whether organized labor executes or not remains to be seen, as Harry said. I mean, the old adage remains true: never underestimate the disorganization of organized labor.
Well, on that note, I'd just like to thank both Harry and Paul for joining me today, and all of you as well. We've had a great discussion on sort of labor and employment issues, and this webinar series will be posted to the COVID resources page for startups, which is available at our website, crea.cornell.edu. And I'd also like to let you know that we're having another webinar in 2 weeks. The next webinar will be focused on equity crowdfunding, and is slated for May 7th at 10 o'clock. So I'd like to, once again, just say thank you to everyone for joining us, and thank you to the guests. We've had a great conversation today, and I hope everybody has a wonderful Thursday. Thanks for tuning in, folks.
Bye, everybody.